There comes a strange moment after awakening, not always immediately. Sometimes it happens after the first wave of joy has passed, after the retreats, after the books, after the conversations that seem to go deeper than anything you used to know, after you have found people who speak the same language of awareness, presence, healing, truth. And yet, one day, you are sitting alone in your room, or driving through a quiet street at night, or lying awake while the whole house is asleep. And something feels empty again. Not empty in the old way. Not the ordinary emptiness of sadness, failure, loneliness, or not getting what you wanted. This is different because you know something real happened. There was a moment when the old sense of self cracked open. You saw through something that had controlled your life for years. And still, something has returned. Something subtle. Something familiar. Something wearing the language of spirituality now. At first, awakening feels like a door opening after that first breakthrough. The whole inner world can become filled with light. There is a sense of release so intense that it almost feels physical, as if a tight shell has finally broken around the being. The old life, with all its pressure and unconscious striving, suddenly looks distant. You look back at it with a strange mixture of compassion and disbelief. How could you have lived that way for so long? How could you have taken that small, anxious self to be the whole of who you were? How could that narrow room have felt like reality? The moment of awakening feels undeniable. It is not a belief. It is not a philosophy borrowed from a teacher. It is not a beautiful concept you decided to adopt. It is an event in the deepest part of experience. Something inside the old frame of identity breaks. The lens through which life had always been interpreted suddenly cracks. The boundaries that once felt solid begin to loosen. The self that once seemed so heavy, so personal, so unquestionable becomes transparent. And for a while, everything feels open. Life appears more vivid. The world feels more alive. Relationships take on a new depth. Silence becomes meaningful. Small moments become charged with presence. You may feel, perhaps for the first time, that you are finally living a real life. And naturally, a new world begins to form around this. You find new communities. You meet people who understand what you are talking about. You speak about awareness, consciousness, truth, freedom, presence, the observer, the death of the ego, the illusion of separation. For a while, it feels like home. Not the old home, not the world of competition, anxiety, noise, performance, and unconscious survival. This feels like a refuge, a more honest place, a softer place. A place where people are finally willing to look beneath the surface. And this has value. It should not be dismissed. There is something profoundly beautiful about the first opening of the heart and mind after a long life of contraction. There is something sacred about discovering that life is not limited to the small story you once believed you were. But this is also where the next illusion begins. Because the mind does not always return as the same old self. Sometimes it returns as the spiritual self. It does not come back wearing the same rough clothes it used to wear. It does not always come back as ambition, anger, insecurity, craving, jealousy, or fear. Sometimes it comes back as wisdom. Sometimes it comes back as depth. Sometimes it comes back as humility. Sometimes it comes back as the one who has awakened. And because this new identity is more refined, it is much harder to see. The old ego was easy to recognize. It wanted approval. It wanted status. It wanted comfort. It wanted to be right. It wanted to win. But the spiritual ego is more subtle. It wants to be conscious. It wants to be deep. It wants to be beyond the ordinary world. It wants to be more awake than others. It wants to be free from ego and secretly takes pride in that freedom. At first, this may be almost invisible. You simply feel different from the world you left behind, different from people who are still chasing money, image, drama, success, distraction, different from those who seem asleep inside the old patterns. And perhaps there is some truth in that difference. But slowly, if it is not seen clearly, that difference becomes superiority. You begin to compare. Who is more awake? Who is still identified? Who has only understood this intellectually? Who is truly seen? Who is stuck at a lower level? Who has gone beyond? Who is still trapped in the mind? Who has reached the real thing? The language changes, but the movement is the same. The mind is still measuring, still separating, still placing itself somewhere, still creating a center around which experience is organized. Only now, the center is spiritual. Roles begin to form. The guide, the healer, the teacher, the student, the awakened one, the one who has seen what others have not yet seen. Communities begin to create boundaries. Teachings become systems. Systems become identities. Identities become groups. Groups begin to compare themselves with other groups. And slowly, without anyone noticing, the world beyond the old world becomes another world of structure, position, belonging, exclusion, comparison, and subtle competition. Everything returns, just in a softer voice. And then, at some point, there may be a painful recognition. The mind was still there. It had not disappeared in awakening. It had only become quiet for a moment. In the shock of that first opening, the old structure was stunned. The usual machinery of thought, defense, desire, fear, and self-reference paused. For a brief time, there was a kind of nakedness, a directness, a sense of being without the old contraction. But when the intensity settled, when the experience became familiar, when the new world began to stabilize, the mind came back. Not as the old worldly self, but as the awakened self. And this is where the real disappointment begins. Because before awakening, you were identified with the ordinary self, the self that wanted success, security, recognition, control, pleasure, love, importance. After awakening, you may become identified with a more refined self, the self that wants spiritual experiences, deep insight, expanded awareness, higher states, purity, freedom, recognition as someone who has gone beyond. The objects have changed, but the movement of possession remains. The mind is still reaching, still collecting, still building a private world around itself, still turning life into something that can be owned, understood, displayed, repeated, and enjoyed before. It collected achievements. Now, it collects realizations. Before, it wanted to be special in the world. Now, it wants to be special beyond the world. Before, it created a personal identity from success and suffering. Now, it creates a spiritual identity from awakening and insight. The costume has changed. The actor has not been fully seen. This is why the phase after awakening can become so confusing. Because the first awakening was real, the opening was real, the freedom was real, the sense that the old self was not the whole truth was real. And yet, the way that experience gets absorbed afterward can still be governed by the same old structure. It is like taking off a pair of dark glasses for years. You saw life through a dark lens. Everything was heavy, narrow, fearful, unconscious. Then, one day, the dark glasses fall away. The relief is immense. You think the problem is over. But then, almost without noticing, you put on a rose-colored lens. At first, it feels like liberation. Of course it does. The world is no longer dark. Everything seems warm, meaningful, beautiful, spiritual. But it is still a lens. The color has changed. The basic act of looking through a lens has not yet been understood. This is one of the most difficult things to face, because the rose-colored lens is so much more pleasant than the dark one. It seems higher, it seems purer, it seems closer to truth. And compared to the old way of seeing, it may genuinely feel like freedom. But if the deeper mechanism of perception has not been seen, if the movement of identity has not been exposed, if the one who wears the lens remains unexamined, then experience has changed, but the root has not been fully touched. And eventually the mind becomes bored again. This is its old law. Whatever the mind possesses, it eventually exhausts. a relationship, a belief, an achievement, a pleasure, a role, a spiritual state. E, a community, a teaching, an identity. At first, it is intoxicating, then it becomes familiar, then it becomes ordinary, then it begins to lose its power. And when the mind becomes bored with ordinary life, it can run towards spirituality. But when it becomes bored with spirituality too, there is nowhere obvious left to run. This is when a much deeper emptiness can open. You no longer belong to the old world. You cannot fully return to the life you once lived. Its ambitions feel too small. Its dramas feel too repetitive. Its promises feel too thin. But the new world has also begun to reveal its limitation. The language of awakening no longer satisfies you. The community no longer saves you. The role no longer feels innocent. The experiences no longer carry the same charge. Even insight can begin to feel like another possession. This is a lonely threshold, because you cannot honestly pretend the first awakening never happened. But you also cannot pretend that the life after it has fully delivered what it seemed to promise. You have touched something real, and yet, the way you have been living around that reality still feels incomplete. This is the great gap, the space between the first opening and a deeper transformation. Many people mistake this gap for failure. They think they have lost their awakening. They think they have fallen back. They think something has gone wrong. They think they need a new teacher, a new method, a new practice, a new experience, a more powerful state. But perhaps this emptiness is not a mistake. Perhaps it is the beginning of a more honest seeing, because the first awakening may break the belief that you are the old self. But the next movement reveals how quickly the mind can turn awakening itself into a new self. This second seeing is much less glamorous. It does not feel like light. It does not feel like expansion. It does not feel like arrival. It does not feel like cosmic confirmation. It feels more like being stripped. Stripped of the old world, stripped of the new world, stripped of the stories that once gave meaning, stripped of the spiritual stories that replaced them. What remains is not yet peace. It is a kind of vast uncertainty, a hollow space, a groundless openness, a silence that does not comfort you immediately. Nothing seems strong enough to hold on to. No philosophy is fully convincing. No identity feels completely innocent. No role can be worn without being felt as a role. The old motivations have burned out. The new motivations have become transparent. The familiar ways of creating meaning no longer work, and the mind, which has always survived by turning life into something it can grasp, stands in a space where there is nothing stable enough to grasp. This is why the emptiness after awakening can feel so frightening. It is not merely depression. It is not simply sadness. It is not the ordinary pain of not getting what you want. It is the exposure of a deeper exhaustion. The exhaustion of the mind's entire way of making meaning. For so long, it created a world. Then it created another world. For so long, it wore one identity. Then it wore a higher identity. For so long, it searched for freedom. Then it tried to own the experience of freedom. And now, all of that begins to show its limit. This is where the real work begins. Not the work of becoming more spiritual. Not the work of collecting more insights. Not the work of building a better version of the awakened self. But the quiet, difficult, precise seeing of the movement that creates the self at all. The mind must be seen not only when it is crude, but when it is subtle. Not only when it is selfish, but when it is spiritual. Not only when it wants the world, but when it wants liberation. Not only when it says, I want to be important, but when it says, I want to be free of the I. This is a very delicate threshold, because if you rush to escape the emptiness, the mind simply begins again. It finds a new frame, a new teaching, a new identity, a new language, a new spiritual home, a new way to feel special, a new way to say, now I understand. But if the emptiness is allowed to reveal itself, if it is not immediately covered with another story, then something deeper becomes possible. The emptiness begins to show what all the previous structures were hiding. It shows the loneliness beneath the spiritual identity, the fear beneath the wisdom, the desire to be safe beneath the language of surrender, the desire to exist as someone beneath the claim of egolessness. And this seeing is not comfortable, but it is honest. The first awakening may open the door, but this deeper emptiness begins to reveal who walked through that door and immediately tried to build a new house on the other side. That is the shock. That is the tenderness. That is the humiliation and the grace of this stage. You realize that the old world was not the only cage. The spiritual world can become a cage too. A luminous cage. A meaningful cage. A beautiful cage. A cage filled with truth, language, community, practice, and insight. But still a cage, if the one who lives inside it has not been seen through. So the question is no longer, how do I become more awakened? The question becomes quieter, more dangerous, more intimate. What is still trying to become something? What is still trying to possess awakening? What is still building a self out of freedom? And when these questions are not used as concepts, when they are allowed to burn through the actual movement of inner life, then the path begins again. But this time, it is not the path toward a spiritual identity. It is the path through the subtle remains of identity itself. And perhaps this is why the emptiness feels so vast, because it is not asking you to find a better world. It is asking you to see the movement that keeps creating worlds around a self. LF, worldly worlds, spiritual worlds, dark lenses, rose-colored lenses, all of them. And when that movement begins to be seen, not as theory, not as belief, not as something to tell others about, but directly, quietly, painfully, truthfully, then the emptiness is no longer merely a void. It becomes the beginning of a deeper stripping away, the beginning of a silence that does not belong to the old self or the spiritual self, the beginning of a transformation that cannot be possessed. And perhaps only here, after the glow has faded, after the roll has cracked, after the mind has been seen wearing even the clothes of awakening, does the real journey begin.